Okay, so today we are diving deep into African history using a book called African History, a very short introduction.
No, okay.
It's by these two authors, John Parker and Richard Rathbone.
Yeah.
Now, anyone who knows a thing or two about Africa knows that you can't just, summarize the whole thing in a short intro.
Right.
And that's really not what this book tries to do either.
No.
It's more about how the African past has been imagined and represented throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
How have people understood it? How have they presented it?
Yeah, exactly. It's not just a straight timeline of everything that's happened.
Right. Yeah.
It's more about how historians have tried to understand Africa's history. What are some of the challenges?
Yeah.
How have interpretations changed over time?
Yeah. So it's more kind of a look at the historian's craft itself. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And Parker and Rathbone offer a really good scholarly look at how we study African history.
Exactly. So what we want to do is pull out some of those key insights from the book. We want to kind of tackle those big questions about what even is Africa? How do you define it and its history?
Right. Yeah.
And then what are some of those forces that have shaped the study of African history? And then we'll touch on some of the main themes that are highlighted in the book.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's dive in.
Okay.
Right from the start, the book makes this point that even thinking about Africa as a place requires us to think historically.
Yeah.
It's not just this static, unchanging entity, right?
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things they talk about is this idea of unpackaging our assumptions, especially those coming from a European perspective.
Yeah, right. For centuries, Europe has kind of viewed Africa through its own lens.
Exactly.
And that lens has often been distorted by, power imbalances and prejudices.
Right. And the book actually points out that these European perceptions of Africa tell us as much about Europe as they do about the actual people and societies of Africa.
Right, yeah.
It's like looking in a mirror, almost.
That's
right?
exactly. And
Yeah.
the image we see says as much about the mirror as it does about the person looking in it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then they go on to talk about how this very concept of Africa, this idea of Africa, was embraced and kind of redefined by Western educated intellectuals from the Black diaspora in the 19th century.
Yeah.
People like, Oloda Equiano,
All right.
Alexander Crummell, Edward W. Blyden.
Yeah.
These thinkers, they lived outside of the continent, right? But they were able to imagine and kind of express a sense of shared African identity in new ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they used the intellectual tools that were available to them at the time.
Right, exactly.
And in the 19th century, that was the language of race.
Yeah. So early Pan-Africanism, really started with this idea of Africa as a homeland connected by a shared Negro race, right?
Right.
Sometimes they even use the term Ethiopia to kind of signify this.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is these ideas started to actually take hold within Africa itself.
Right.
Particularly among educated communities in coastal West Africa.
Yeah.
And this was happening right around the same time as the scramble for Africa was gaining momentum.
Yeah, it's almost like, they were reclaiming the idea of Africa at the very moment Europe was trying to carve it up.
Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting. Okay, so now the book doesn't shy away from the complexities and even the contradictions within this early Pan-Africanist thinking.
Right.
For instance, North Africa.
Yeah.
North Africa posed a real challenge to these kind of developing definitions of Africa and the black race.
Yeah.
Because European imperialists often saw North Africa as part of a different world altogether.
Yeah. Right. They thought of it as more like a decaying civilization.
Yeah.
Separate from what they considered tribal Africa, south of the Sahara.
Exactly. And even within the early Pan-Africanist movement, there were totally different views on Islam.
All right.
Some thinkers, like Blyden, he saw Islam as a potential unifying force.
Yeah.
A kind of redemptive force, almost.
Right.
But then others saw its historical connection to slavery as a huge problem.
Right.
So it just shows you how much diversity of thought there was even within this early Pan-Africanist movement.
Yeah, it was not a monolithic movement by any means.
No, not at all. Okay, so then there's this other thing the book talks about, the Hamitic hypothesis. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was this totally bizarre racial theory from the Victorian era.
Right.
And basically it suggested that any significant cultural achievements in Black Africa, like, weren't actually the work of Black Africans.
Yeah.
But rather, they were the work of these lighter-skinned invaders from the north.
Yeah.
And what's striking is that some early Pan-Africanists actually adopted this flawed theory.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of strange.
Because they were trying to link Black history to the Middle East,
right,
where, Christianity originated.
Right.
And by doing so, they hoped to kind of place Black history within this perceived, universal historical narrative.
Yeah, they were trying to fit into the dominant framework of the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if that framework was ultimately flawed.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that even those who are striving for liberation and unity can sometimes adopt problematic ideas.
Yeah.
Without realizing it. So, and this question of what even is African history, like what geographical area does it cover, it remains a big point of discussion among historians even today.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, where do we draw the boundaries of African history?
Right.
John Iliffe, for example, he takes a really broad view.
Yeah.
He includes the entire continent from north to south in his idea of African history.
Right.
But then you have Frederick Cooper, who focuses more specifically on sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
And he argues that that's where the truly distinct historical experience lies.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have South Africa with its unique history of European settlement.
Right.
And Madagascar as well.
Right. Which is geographically part of Africa.
Right, but often gets left out of broader narratives about the continent.
Exactly. So it's like you have this tension between a broad, like, continental perspective and a more focused sub-Saharan one.
Yeah.
And then some scholars even argue that you should include the African diaspora.
Yeah.
They see African history as extending into this whole Black Atlantic world.
Right, so it really makes you think about the boundaries we create when we talk about history.
Yeah.
Like, are those boundaries real, or are they just constructs?
Yeah. Okay, so now, the book also acknowledges that, these old, rigid categories of, like, races and tribes, they've been challenged.
Yeah, and for good reason.
Right, they've been largely dismantled. But the authors argue that after all the work that's been done to kind of recover and understand the continent's past, we can't just throw away the idea of Africa itself.
Right.
Like, there is a shared history there, even though it's incredibly diverse.
Yeah, there's definitely a shared historical experience that connects the continent.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about defining Africa and its history. Like, what even is African history? Now, let's think about the things that have shaped how that history has been studied and understood over time.
Right.
And the book makes this point that our own concerns and perspectives in the present really influence how we view the past.
Yeah, that's true for any kind of history, really.
Right.
Our present always colors our view of the past.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The book even brings up Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Oh, yeah.
They suggest that work actually reflected a lot of the anxieties that were, prevalent in Gibbon's own time.
Yeah, it's like he was looking back at Rome and seeing parallels to his own society.
Yeah. And when it comes to African history, the book really highlights how the focus of historical studies has changed a lot over the last 50 years or so.
Right.
And it kind of mirrors, like, the continent's own journey, through independence and all that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting parallel. So in the 1960s, with all the energy around independence movements, the focus was very much on political history. Like, historians were really interested in the histories of African states before colonialism.
All right.
It was all about reclaiming that pre-colonial past and showing that Africans had agency, that they weren't just passive recipients of European influence.
Exactly. Then in the 1970s, a lot of these newly independent nations started running into political and economic problems.
Right.
And so the focus kind of shifted towards economic history.
Yeah.
Historians were trying to figure out, like, the root causes of these issues. Looking at the impact of global economic forces on the continent.
Yeah, like, how did colonialism shape Africa's economic development?
Exactly. And then later on, there was this growing interest in social history.
Yeah.
Going beyond the big political events and the stories of great men.
Right.
And really trying to explore the lives of ordinary people.
Yeah, the everyday experiences of men and women.
Exactly.
What did it mean to live through these historical changes?
Exactly. So it's fascinating how those those pressing issues of the present really kind of drive the questions historians ask about the past.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about the continent itself.
Okay.
It's incredible diversity.
Yeah.
But also, the underlying connections and kind of sense of unity that runs through it. So Africa's physical diversity is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's a vast continent with so many different environments.
You have, the Atlas Mountains in the north.
Right.
You have the Rift Valley cutting through East Africa.
Yeah.
You have Mount Kilimanjaro, the Congo Basin.
Right.
And the book points out that only a fairly small portion of the continent is at high altitude.
Right.
Most of it is this massive plateau.
Yeah, it's like this ancient platform of rocks and soils.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, you have this incredible variety of ecological zones.
Oh, yeah.
Arranged in these bands that run parallel to the equator,
right.
As the rainfall patterns shift.
Yep.
So you have lush rainforests,
yeah,
open woodlands, savanna grasslands, Sahel, the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
And then the Mediterranean climate along the north coast.
Right.
And similar patterns south of the equator as well.
Exactly. It's like a mosaic of different worlds.
Yeah.
All in one continent. And what's interesting is that these ecological zones, they're not static.
No, they've changed a lot over time.
Right.
Both in, long-term geological shifts and in seasonal rhythms.
Right. And the book really stresses how much of Africa's landscape is anthropogenic.
Yeah, meaning it's been shaped by human activity.
Exactly. So over thousands of years, people have modified the environment.
Right.
You see this in things like the introduction of new food crops.
Yeah, for example, barley and wheat.
Right.
They originated in Asia.
Right.
Bananas came from Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And then maize and cassava came from the Americas.
Right. And those introductions completely revolutionized agriculture across the continent.
Yeah. And of course, we can't forget the modern urban landscapes.
Right.
Which are expanding rapidly.
Yeah. Close to half of Africa's population lives in cities now.
Yeah, it's a huge demographic shift.
Okay, so one of the most dramatic and impactful environmental changes was the Sahara drying out. So about 10,000 years ago, it was much wetter.
Right.
It had lakes and grasslands.
Yeah.
Supported lots of people.
Right.
But then over time, the rainfall declined.
Yeah.
And it slowly transformed into this hyper-arid desert that we know today.
Right.
And this change triggered huge population movements southward.
Yeah.
And it also concentrated people in areas like the Nile Valley.
Right.
Which the book points out played a huge role in the emergence of centralized kingdoms in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, it's like the drying of the Sahara kind of pushed people together and created the conditions for these complex societies to develop.
Right. And it also created a big geographical barrier between sub-Saharan Africa and Eurasia.
Yeah, for a long time they were relatively isolated from each other.
Right. And it wasn't until, much later, when the camel was domesticated, that you start to see more regular travel across the Sahara.
Yeah, the camel really opened up the Sahara to trade and communication.
Okay, now when we think about the histories that unfolded in these different environments, one thing that often comes to mind is the sequence of those great West African empires.
Okay. Yeah.
Ghana, Mali, Songhay.
Right.
Even before African history became like a formal academic field,
yeah,
these empires were really important in how people understood the continent's past.
Yeah, they were seen as evidence of a sophisticated and complex African civilization.
Right.
And for early African American scholars and later for nationalist historians in newly independent African countries,
yeah,
these empires were really important symbols.
Right.
They showed that Africa had a long tradition of state building and political organization.
Yeah, it challenged those European ideas of a primitive Africa.
Exactly.
Okay, so to reconstruct the history of these empires, historians have to rely on all sorts of different sources.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
You have accounts from North African travelers.
Like Ibn Battuta.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have Arabic chronicles written by scholars.
Uh-huh.
And you also have indigenous oral traditions.
Yeah, like the Mande Kumakoro.
Right.
Or the Epic of Sunjata.
Yeah, exactly. But it's important to remember that, all of these sources, they come with challenges.
Yeah.
For example, relying too heavily on those early accounts from Muslim visitors.
Right.
It can sometimes lead to an overemphasis on external factors.
Yeah, like the impact of Islam or long-distance trade.
Exactly.
But we have to be careful not to downplay the role of internal factors as well.
Right. And then oral traditions, a lot of them are only written down in the 20th century.
Yeah.
So we need to understand, like, the context in which they were recorded.
Right.
And their role within the societies that preserved them.
Yeah, like who was telling these stories?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
The Epic of Sunjata, this amazing song cycle performed by griots. It's a really good example of how rich and complex these oral sources can be.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we have this really powerful imperial tradition in West Africa.
Yeah.
But the book also points out that, there's a contrast between, like, the first millennium AD, which seems to have been a period of stability and harmony.
Right.
And then, later periods in the Sudanic region, which were marked by more violence and decline.
Yeah, it's not a simple story of continuous progress.
Right. And you see this pattern of ambitious state builders vying for power and resources.
Yeah.
So it's just a reminder that history doesn't always move in a straight line.
No, it's full of twists and turns.
Exactly. Okay, so now the book shifts our attention to the huge diversity of people within Africa.
Yeah.
Making generalizations about Africans as a whole.
Right.
It's just not accurate.
No, it's like saying all Europeans are the same.
Yeah, exactly. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And scientific evidence really backs this up. Recent genetic studies have shown that there's actually more genetic variation within African populations than there is between Africans and other groups.
Yeah, like Europeans.
Right.
So that kind of blows those old racist theories out of the water.
Yeah, it totally undermines those old ideas about race.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have this incredible linguistic diversity in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
Around 1,500 languages spoken across the continent.
Yeah. And they belong to 4 major language families.
Right. I mean, Nigeria alone has over 300 different languages.
Yeah. It's mind-boggling.
It's just amazing. But sadly, a lot of these languages are endangered.
Yeah, because of, various historical and social pressures.
Right.
They're being replaced by regional lingua francas, or by European languages.
Right.
Which gained prominence during the colonial era.
Exactly. And this linguistic diversity, it's a reflection of a whole multiplicity of cultures.
Yeah.
Expressed in everything from music and dance to art and architecture.
Right. And African music, in particular, has had a huge impact on the world.
Oh, yeah.
Think about its influence in the Americas.
Right.
It's given rise to so many different musical genres.
Yeah. And then those genres have, flowed back into Africa in new forms.
Right. It's this constant back and forth exchange.
Right. Okay, and then you have a whole range of religious beliefs in Africa.
Yeah.
From those deep-rooted indigenous belief systems to world religions like Islam and Christianity.
Yeah.
And both of those religions have, taken on their own African expressions.
Right. They've been adapted and reinterpreted in African contexts.
Exactly. You have the Murid Brotherhood in Senegal.
Yeah.
The Aladura churches in Nigeria. Vodun and Orisha traditions in the Americas, which originated in West Africa.
Right. So it's not just about, Islam or Christianity in a generic sense. Mm-hmm. It's about how those religions have been lived and practiced in Africa.
Exactly. Okay, so the key point here is that this diversity, this linguistic, cultural, and political diversity, it's not random.
No.
It's a result of historical processes.
Right. Things like migration, conquest, trade, the spread of religion, colonialism.
Exactly. The book uses North Africa as a good example of this mixing of peoples and cultures.
Yeah, North Africa's a really fascinating case.
You have, Berber and ancient Egyptian roots.
Yeah.
And then, influences from the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, Jewish communities, sub-Saharan Africans, and then Europeans later on.
Right. It's like all of these different cultures have left their mark on the region.
And this has led to this incredible cultural fusion.
Yeah, you see it in the art, the architecture, the music, the food.
Exactly. Think about Moroccan tagine.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. It's this blend of all these different influences.
Exactly. Okay, so now, while North Africa is a well-documented example, the book stresses that the histories of most African peoples reveal similar patterns of interaction and exchange.
Right.
Although sometimes they're less thoroughly documented.
Yeah.
So for some groups, isolation was like a deliberate strategy.
Right.
You know, they wanted to stay apart from others.
Yeah.
And then for other groups, it was the result of being pushed into more marginal areas,
Sure.
like the pygmies of the Ituri rainforest.
Yeah.
Or the sand people of the Kalahari Desert.
Right.
Okay, so we talk about diversity.
Yeah.
But it's also really important to move away from that old European view of Africa.
Right.
As just a collection of isolated tribes.
Yeah, that's a really outdated and inaccurate view.
Right. And contemporary scholarship is really focusing on this interconnectedness within Africa.
Yeah, looking at things like population movements,
Right.
trade networks, the flow of cultural ideas.
Exactly. And not just within Africa itself,
Right.
but also into the diaspora.
Yeah.
You know, across the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean.
Yeah, so it's a much more dynamic and interconnected picture of Africa than we used to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now this interconnectedness also brings up the idea of unity.
Yeah.
You know, you have the emergence of what they call vindicationist literature,
Right. Yeah.
which really focused on asserting the racial unity and the dignity of people of African descent,
Yeah.
and celebrating their historical achievements. You know, thinkers like Blyden and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
They articulated these powerful visions of shared heritage.
Right. They were trying to reclaim African history and present it in a positive light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have the concept of negritude, which emerged in Francophone Africa.
Yeah.
And this was a direct challenge to those imperialist racial ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
And it really celebrated the richness of African culture.
Yeah.
Although it sometimes leaned toward this idea of a kind of homogenous African people.
Right. It's interesting to compare that to earlier Anglophone West African scholars, like Reverend Samuel Gonson,
Right.
who emphasized shared cultural similarities rather than essentialized racial differences.
Exactly. And then you have this idea of a singular, like, foundational African civilization.
All right.
Which persists in various forms of Afrocentrism.
Yeah, especially in its Egyptocentric forms.
Right. So some works, like Martin Bernal's Black Athena, they try to make a scholarly case for these connections between ancient Egypt and ancient Greece.
Yeah.
But the book makes it clear that a lot of what's called Afrocentrism is just not really supported by evidence.
Yeah.
And it's mostly outside of mainstream historical scholarship.
Right.
Okay, so ultimately this idea of African unity, it's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
especially in political and social movements.
Right.
But ideology can't replace the actual complex and diverse history of all these different peoples.
Right. You can't just impose a single narrative on such a complex reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's dive into this topic of identity.
Okay.
Which is, really complex in the African context.
Yeah.
So for Africans, just like for anyone else, identity is multifaceted.
Right.
It's fluid.
Yeah.
And it's constantly being negotiated.
Right. It's not something that's fixed or static.
Exactly. The book uses this really interesting example of Zinedine Zidane.
Oh, yeah.
The footballer.
Yeah.
So he can identify as French,
Right.
North African, Berber, Muslim.
Yeah.
And a football player.
Right.
Among other things.
Right.
So, which of these identities is most important at any given time?
Yeah.
It really depends on the context.
Yeah, exactly.
And it shows how you can have this self-identification.
Right.
But also identities that are imposed on you by others.
Yeah, and those two things aren't always the same.
Right. And all of these non-biological forms of identity,
Right.
whether it's racial, political, cultural, religious, they're not inherent.
No.
They're constructed through history.
Right, they're products of historical processes.
Exactly. And they can change over time.
Yeah, they're not fixed or permanent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as the Rwandan genocide tragically shows, they can be really dangerous.
Yeah.
When they're manipulated and turned into these rigid categories.
Or it's a sobering reminder of how powerful identity can be.
Yeah, and how dangerous it can be when it's used to divide people.
Yeah.
So the book emphasizes how important it is to understand how Africans themselves see their own identities.
Right.
Rather than just relying on labels imposed from the outside.
Yeah, we need to listen to how people define themselves.
exactly. Okay, so the book gives these two really interesting 19th century examples of identity formation.
Yeah.
The first one is the emergence of this broader Yoruba identity.
Right.
Among Western educated Christians, like Samuel Ajay Crowther.
Right.
And they kind of linked Christianity to this vision of a unified Yoruba